They know only that world, and they look at the distance between their world and a similar world, say in San Francisco, call the intervening America of 3,000 miles flyover country. They believe that things will fall apart if DOGE continues its work. And that is completely at odds with how the majority of Americans feel. And by the way, it represents an alternative reality. It's a reality that has not a single point of tangency with the reality of most Americans.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're in Londinium. It is a beautiful spring evening. We're looking to, later on, sacrifice to the god Augustus, who got us here, and then going to the theater. But in the interim, we're discussing events of these last days in the 21st century. Remember, we're secure here in the first. We've made certain of that. We don't want to be senators. It's too expensive and dangerous. We're in Londinium, which is the frontier of the empire, but it's very far from Rome. It's got a great big body of water that slows anybody down who wants to reach us with a message, and vice versa if somebody wants to rat on us. So we're safe. We make certain we take up our cups of wine in this very pleasant place by the Thames without any walls listening. But we're not saying anything too disruptive. Our emperor is, we know, on his way out. In the meantime, he gives orders. And the empire is confident of itself, as it will be for the next 15 centuries, through a lot of bumpy times. We're paying attention to the empire that the Americans have in the 21st century, because there's less confidence among Americans as there is among the Roman citizens we know. We begin with what has troubled America these last years, at least since 2014, which is what is to be done with Ukraine. Is this striving for freedom and the republic and the American way? Or is it what it was declared several times in these last years, the most corrupt government in all of Europe, which is a heck of a attribute. However, it is now at war, has been for several years. And within these last days, the emperor of the American empire, sometimes called the president, Mr. Trump, has offered Russia a deal that is too good to turn down. Russia gets to be in charge. Russia gets to win. And I congratulate Germanicus for being stout-hearted through these years of explaining again and again and again that Russia will win. Russia was always going to win. Germanicus, the floor is yours to explain to our very happy audience why this was never in doubt, and that the sustaining of Ukraine these last years pleased the Biden administration, as the sustaining of Ukraine before pleased the Obama administration. Now, Mr. Trump had an opportunity in his first term to address the inconsistencies. He did not. It appears that this time he's ready, or is he? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. We have to establish, although everyone should know, but apparently they don't, and that's not people's fault. It is perfectly due to the spigot of pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian propaganda that's kept everyone's vision clouded for the last 3 years or maybe the last decade. But it's important to establish why Russia won. And then it's important to establish why the leadership of the United States and of NATO could not see this. And finally, why they could do nothing about it, even as their situation eroded day after day. So Russia revived under Mr. Putin, and it came back. At first, it crawled back tooth and nail, and then it regained a lot of its composure and then confidence under Mr. Putin in the early 2000s. And the wars that Russia had to fight, first with the Chechen insurgents, and there were a couple wars with the Chechens, and they were bloody wars, but Russia's being able to defeat them, and this was early on in the period after the end of the Soviet Union, at least ensured that Russia would stay together. Then from there, as former Soviet republics um, created problems with Russian minority areas, and this was true in Georgia with Abkhazia and South Ossetia that wanted to break away. Russia fought a short war in 2008 with Georgia and won it handily, and that perked up the attention of the West, but it didn't sink in. The the U.S. was hell bent on expanding NATO, and in not embracing Russia, not bringing Russia into the fold the way they so easily could have into a larger European American transatlantic trans-European alliance. Not doing that was a giant error. But then that error was compounded by an insistence on pushing NATO to the east. And it was one thing to bring in former Warsaw Pact nations that had been seized, as it were, by Stalin after World War II, but it was quite another to go into areas that had been Russian for several hundred years, like Ukraine. Um, and the result, predictably, because many predicted it from Kennan to Kissinger and more, that there would be a war over this because Russians in large number, again, thanks to Stalin, lived in Donbass. Crimea had been Russian for hundreds of years. And in fact, the entire swath of southern Ukraine had never been Ukrainian. It had been before the Russians uh, ruled by Tatars. It had been a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, the Khanate of Crimea. So this was in every way a bad initiative on the part of the U.S. And the U.S. kept pushing it until it led to war. And war actually broke out in 2014 thanks to a coup that the U.S. engineered that led to a Ukrainian government in which extreme right wingers who had descended from collaborators with the Nazis were a major element. And the war that began shortly thereafter persisted. It was a kind of a frozen conflict. And then ultimately, the U.S. had rearmed Ukraine to the point where it could establish dominance over Donbass and was preparing to invade Donbass and finally bring it to heel. And it was at that point that Russia intervened a second time. They'd intervened in 2014. Now in 2022, they invaded Ukraine to overthrow the government that was so inimical and that was hell bent on joining NATO and bringing NATO military forces and nuclear weapons very close to Moscow. It was an untenable situation. Now, the war has been going on for 3 years, and for the entire 3 years, Western quote unquote experts insisted that Russia could not win and that it would at some point come apart. It would come apart economically because of US sanctions, and it would also be unable to impose its will on the battlefield. And that in the process of fighting, it would lose so much of its equipment, much of which was from the Soviet era, and it would lose so many men that it would be forced to come to terms. And in fact, the opposite attained. The Russian war economy was mobilized. Russians, which before the war supported Mr. Putin at a level of between 70, close to 80%, supported the new war with Ukraine, the enlarged war with Ukraine, to an even greater degree. Putin has had no real opposition. And there's been a great enthusiasm, and that enthusiasm can be measured by the fact that when Russia mobilized, um, it was able to get by with volunteers. There were over 20,000 men a month and are still at that number joining, volunteering, enlisting today. And
Germanicus, just a moment. I want to make certain of one thing. I'm following you very carefully. We knew this. It's generally understood. Russia goes to a war economy and wins ugly. We knew this. It's Russian history.
well, we did.
Did Washington not know it?
Well, here I'll use an analogy to Germany after World War One. The Germans always feared Russia. And before World War One, the Germans were petrified, literally, of the great strides Russia was making in industrialization,
Yes.
in reforming their military. So Germany made its war plans all around the need to be able to ultimately defeat Russia. And what happened in World War One, and this is extremely important, is that Germany did defeat Russia. And so in World War Two, it was not unreasonable for Hitler, looking at the mess the Soviets had made of the former Russian Empire and of the crimes of Stalin and the slaughter of his own general officers in the late 30s, that Russia would be a pushover. And so that similar kind of shift in analysis happened to the US. So there was incredible respect and anxiety about the Soviet forces that were only 100 miles from the French border and that occupied East Germany. The US and Europe did not think they could hold these forces back, and we'd have to go very quickly to nuclear war. So there was that sense. And as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, like a house of cards, we thought, oh, this was all a Potemkin village, that the Russians had pulled the wool over our eyes for 40 years, and and that the new Russian Federation was equally, as Hitler had thought of the Soviet Union in the late 30s, um, a door to be kicked down. You just kick in the door and it'll be over. And so the US had switched to a narrative replacement for the Cold War vision of the unstoppable Russia, which was the equivalent of the pre 1914 German vision of the Russian steamroller. And they switched that out very quickly to the Russians are nothing more than a gas station with nukes. They're a paper tiger. They're a Potemkin village updated by a couple centuries. We convinced ourselves of that. And so for the first, I would say, 2.5 years of this current war, analysts kept saying, oh, the Russians are going to run out of missiles. They're going to run out of tanks. See, they're taking up old T-62s and even, God forbid, T-55s, and they're throwing them into the fray.
We just have a couple of minutes, Germanicus. Let's get to the payoff. When did Washington wake up? Was it Trump's election? Was it Trump's inauguration? Was it Trump and Putin? When did Washington realize that it's over?
It was a series of disasters that accumulated, the first one being the failed offensive
Right.
of 2023. And then this constant drumbeat of cities falling to the Russians, and an obvious problem with Ukrainian manpower that was emerging that couldn't be it couldn't be written away. It couldn't be sort of denied any
What
longer.
about the missing billions? Does that bother Washington?
Yes, but I think even more than the missing billions is where the missing billions of military equipment went. So 30 to 40% of what we gave the Ukrainians was sold on the black market. It's been an absolute calamity for us.
Was the Biden administration knowledgeable of these matters and skip past it because they were always in an election mode, or
You
did
have
they not know?
you have to look at this gigantic American executive branch of just hundreds and hundreds of agencies and departments. And some of them know. NSA probably knew. There were people in the Pentagon who knew, and even in CIA, including the CIA director, Mr. Burns, who warned of not pushing Russia. There were lots of people who knew and lots of groups in the government, but the overwhelming desire on the part of the administration, which flowed from the deteriorating mind of the emperor himself, was that we must win.
All right, we have a minute left. Trump knows. Trump knows. Is that correct?
I think he does because he said the kind of key phrases that will not only signal to the Russians that he knows, but also basically inform us that the actual events as they've unfolded or unraveled, depending on your perspective, are very different from the bill of goods we've been sold for the past.
And the tantrum that Zelensky threw, does that mean he knows?
Zelensky knows everything. I mean, he's the corrupt leader who is also a puppet of a billionaire. Of course, he's known his whole time that he only is as good as the support he has behind him from his puppet masters.
We need to turn to the EU. Just a moment, though. Does the EU know?
The EU is desperate because the EU is really the elite. And the elites know that if this is all suddenly revealed as a debacle of their making, or certainly at least of their acquiescence, but they were too eager and enthusiastic to push the blame on the US. They pushed the war. The war is a debacle and they will lose power. So what they're trying to do is create some kind of desperate plug-in narrative that they can
Ah, a
forward to buy time.
interval. Remember decent interval in
Yeah, something
Vietnam?
like that. Yeah,
The U.S. leaves, and X number of months go by where we're supporting them, and then Ukraine fails.
right.
That gives them a way out. And we need to discuss the EU the next time we meet because there's comedy here. The One of the pieces of comedy I enjoy is London and Paris are okay with Germany rearming. Now,
Well, they don't believe it'll happen, of course.
80 years ago, that was not a laugh line.
Mm.
So, so Russia is aware that Germany's going to spend money, but it needs energy to do it. So Russia encourages your Germany to re-up its armaments industry because it needs lots of energy to do it.
Well, Germany between 33 and 39 completely left Britain and France with their huge militaries in place in the dust. It rearmed in 6 years to the point where the next year it could completely defeat the armies of Britain, France, and several other countries. Germany would take decades to even get production going on tanks.
You're going to spend the money, Michael.
Yeah, but that money doesn't equal output. This is the terrible
Oh,
truth.
I agree with that. It's just that that's what Russia cares about.
Well,
But
it does, but Russia spent the money and it's had the output. But I don't think the West is able to do that because it's deindustrialized.
does Washington know that the EU is failing? Does I'm pushing this because I want to know how much they all are aware of the game they're playing.
Well, the EU can fail in a positive way and then discover it needs to get together, or it can come apart. And my feeling is I don't think that the calculus today is that the EU is so important that we need to worry because the EU has declined economically vis-a-vis the US and the rest of the world so dramatically in the last 30 years that it is no longer the powerhouse of the world economy that it was in 1990.
Yes, but it's 750 million educated consumers, and so we can sell them.
Well, they're consumers, yeah. That's true. They're about 400 and some odd million
And
people.
last difficult question, and then we have to go home. How long until the EU says Ukraine lost?
This will come in months.
Yeah.
Right now, the collapse of the Kursk salient and the bag of prisoners, as they often say, is going to just be a defeat that no one can escape. And I think that's why the Russians want to conclude it quickly, because it will show to everyone that this is not a war that can continue much longer.
We've moved from the European map to the American map, to Washington, D.C. And every day brings another announcement of tens of thousands of layoffs, tens of thousands of people told you're on sabbatical or go home and we'll pay you through such and such a date. And then in the afternoon, a federal judge here, a federal judge there says, temporary restraining order, restore the jobs, or turn the planes around, or you have no right to do that, or you got to rehire these people because the government can't work without them. Now, all that is melodrama, and we don't speak to it. We do speak to Main Street, however, quite different from Washington, D.C. And Germanicus, in the 21st century, whatever has happened in the previous 250 years, the Americans on Main Street evidenced no sympathy whatsoever for the federal government. How did this happen?
It happened over a long period of time. Americans supported the new government bureaucracies that were created by the FDR administration because they were directly supporting Americans. In fact, the Works Progress Administration and others actually gave employment to hundreds of thousands of Americans out of work. It was critical to the cohesion of American society during the Depression. And then, of course, with the advent of World War II, the mobilization and rearmament allowed the economy to take off. And the victorious war sort of was a great capstone to the revival of America. And so the government coming out of World War II trusted the government. The government had created a kind of Soviet state in World War II. I mean, it was not just a command economy, it was very much a government-run society for those 4 years, which was necessary, perhaps. But after the war, Americans didn't feel.
It's technically called war Keynesianism. That's what the Russians call it.
Oh yeah, there are all sorts of names, but the truth is that it worked. And you see, what I'm trying to get at is the Americans felt not only supportive of what government was doing, they were confident the government could do it well and successfully. And so this continued in the arc up until the Great Society of LBJ. And famously, Lyndon Baines Johnson had promised guns and butter because he started what amounted to a great war in Vietnam and had all of these new government programs. And it didn't work, but it took a long time for it to come down. I mean, Richard Nixon continued all of the Great Society programs in terms of social welfare. And the safety net, as it has been called, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera, have been supported by Americans. The problem has come with the development of a giant bureaucracy which is geared to pushing the agenda of the ruling elites. And this has become more and more clear in recent decades. And the great achievement of DOGE is to expose the ways in which government programs using taxpayer money were being used to promote the political ends of blue, the Democratic Party. And that has come as a shock. And then the workforce has grown steadily over the decades to the point where it is gigantic. And the work that it does, that Americans approve of, mainly managing the disbursement of remittances to Americans that they paid into, like Social Security, does not require a huge number of people. So where are these millions of people gainfully employed? What are they actually doing? So it's been a kind of confluence on one hand of an awareness of this giant sort of alternative parallel society in American life, and on the other hand, uh, claiming an increasing amount of taxpayer dollars.
Taxpayer dollars and time. I get now and again a mailing or an email from the Department of Commerce because I have a small business, a C corporation.
Hmm.
And it's a lengthy document I have to fill out to tell them what I'm doing and who I am and how much I make. Why do they need this? I don't know. They don't tell me. It's a waste of my time. It's a waste of money to have dreamed it up. Who's ever at the other end of receiving this document, and I think I've had more than one, especially under the Biden administration. I don't know that it's coming again under the Trump administration, but definitely during Biden. That's
Yeah.
the federal government, Germanicus.
Well, you see, the government costs money, and the U.S. debt to GDP ratio
I,
is it's 1.2, which is what it was in 1945, where the debt is bigger than the GDP. And just a few decades ago, even as recently as 1980, it was 0.32, 0.32. So we've got $36 trillion of debt. And the service on that debt just this past year surpassed what we spend on the military. It's over $1 trillion we have to pay just to service the
but
debt.
that doesn't explain how shocked they act when they get fired.
They don't understand this because the people who work for the government are also the same people who have a larger entitlement that they
Yeah.
know best. And therefore, when they came up with these economic theories under the Biden administration that basically said you could just print money and it's fine, there won't be any inflation, um, that was great. And there was zero opposition from within government to the gigantic expenditures, not just during COVID, but following COVID under the Biden administration.
Now, what happens next? You live in the Washington area. 9 out of the 20 richest counties in America in 2019 were in the DC suburbs. What is going to happen at the DC suburbs? Do they abandon them? Do they find new things to do? We're talking about professionals who've confidently assumed their lives were taken care of.
Well, a significant tranche can retire and go into contract work, which will still be available, I assume. Another tranche will leave. I don't know how many. I don't think this will be as severe as the flight from aerospace that occurred with the peace dividend. But all those people who left the aerospace industry in Southern California, a lot of them just moved north and helped create the internet revolution, in Silicon Valley. So I think they'll have to find other employment. And then others, well, there are other jobs and they're going to have to look for them.
Again, I don't hear Main Street have evidencing any sympathy. Do you hear in Washington that the federal workers understand that or know it?
No, no, no. And of course, most people in a smaller world, which we call the Washington bubble, they know only that world, and they look at the distance between their world and a similar world, say in San Francisco, call the intervening America of 3,000 miles flyover country. It doesn't really exist. It helped seal their fate in the last election, but they believe a great crime is being committed. They believe that things will fall apart if DOGE continues its work. And that is completely at odds with how the majority of Americans feel. And by the way, it represents a an alternative reality. It's a reality that has not a single point of tangency with the reality of most Americans.
One more question. Mr. Trump campaigned on DOGE. Musk was there. They said what they were going to do. Mr. Trump won a very clear victory. Electoral college, popular vote, all the states that were in between, the battleground states, he won endorsing what DOGE was going to become.
Right.
Did Washington not believe it?
Washington had become a wholly owned franchise set of subsidiaries of an elite class that had the commanding heights. And one of the bastions of the commanding heights was the government. It was the largest bastion, the others being universities, nonprofits, the woke corporate world. And they had presided for all of the administrations they had probably known in their adult life since Bill Clinton. They knew that a new administration would not come through on any of their promises, and none of them ever did. You remember when George W. Bush was pushing the fact that in 2000 that we needed adults in the room and we were not going to go to war. Well, how did that turn out? And up and down the line, there's never been any question that the government would continue to grow in size and in power. So it's a complete shock. It's a shock of existential proportions.
Germanicus is my Greek whisperer. Now, the Greeks work for us because they can count, they can write, they can read, they're smart. Eventually, we know they're going to take over the Roman Empire. Good for them. They're really good managing editors of estates, which is what they do for us. Where did that come from? I don't know. It's in the water in the Mediterranean. However, the Greeks are also inventive, or they were, and we've inherited their invention. One is the word tyranny, another is the word republic. We've inherited them, we Romans. Didn't work out so well for us, so we got rid of the republic, and now we're very happy with an emperor who no one calls a tyrant, but in the original understanding of that word for the Greeks, and this is tricky because it's a translation problem, a tyrant was a strong man. And Germanicus is okay with me saying cardio, which is the New World version of a strong man. Liked, loved, celebrated by the people, not hated. And the word tyrant has the bite of brutality. However, the city was Syracuse, which is now Sicily. And this is early 4th century BCE, between 400 and 350, somewhere in there. And Syracuse becomes a very powerful state under tyrants, under strongmen. But there's this dream of a republic, or restoring the republic, or in some fashion having democracy the way Athens brags about, eventually brags to the point that everybody gets bored hearing it. However, there's a story behind this. It's quite dramatic. It has lots of reversals. It's a melodrama about a man named Dionysius, his son-in-law's brother-in-law, a man named Dion, and money changing hands, and tyranny and conquest. And eventually, according to some observers, it comes out that the republic is restored. I don't believe it, because it's a fairy tale. Involved in all this, and it's really wears you down to follow the hemming and hawing, is a man named Plato, whom we inherit as a great philosopher. Well, Plato got mixed up with the hemming and hawing in Syracuse and wrote a series of letters, some of which are forgeries, some of which are real, in one of which he reveals himself as sort of a McKinsey consultant to the dictator, to the tyrant.
Yes.
And was unapologetic about it, but acknowledged that his perfect republic. Germanicus, I don't want to make a conclusion here. I've read that Plato's perfect republic was much closer to tyranny than a republic. Is that a fair generalization?
In many ways, Plato's Republic described the American system. When you had a philosopher king who could be like the president, but then you had an aristocracy around him who were not inherited aristocrats in terms of money, but rather um, groomed, properly tutored young men and women who would be the guardians, as it were. So you have an idea of a meritocratic oligarchy and a single leader who would be not a tyrant, but certainly the kind of a top dog, the jefe.
You're describing the Obama-Biden administrations.
That's sort of what I'm getting at because but the Democrats really believe in rule by experts. They believe that if the people who have the degrees and the people who have the sort of credentialed, entitled, virtuous outlook should be the ones in charge. And this is not congenial to the people. And the problem with Syracuse is they had, standard Greek tyrants. The people didn't like these tyrants, especially the two that they had in that period around, I don't know, about 360 BC, 370, Dionysius the first and his ne'er-do-well son, Dionysius the second. And they wanted something closer to democracy. Now, the Greeks didn't have working republics. That really was a Roman innovation in many ways. The Greeks had this democracy idea, and then they had other city-states that were ruled by kings or by oligarchs. And the fact is, the people were not happy in Syracuse, and the people wanted a democracy. And Dion, who was the most capable man in Syracuse and the main advisor to Dion.
Extremely rich, might have even owned a car company or two. Yes.
This is the problem with democracy is all the leaders in Greek democracies and city-states were filthy rich. And in fact, they were expected to personally underwrite and finance the military equipment, like the ships. At one point in this whole soap opera, Dion offered to give Syracuse 25 triremes, for some venture. It's really rather amazing. And so they are a lot like, you could liken Dion to one of the billionaires, even Mr. Musk. And the people supported him, and he eventually took over with the failure of the wayward Dionysius. And yet the people found they didn't like his rule because he wanted to impose a Platonic republic, one which would not meet the people's will. And so eventually this went on for 30 years or so. And a guy named Timoleon finally gave the people their wish after a number of wars and just upheavals. The city was burned at one point, but eventually they got their democracy. I don't see any kind of happy ending like that for the United States. The problem in the Greek world and the Roman world was that democracies were too chaotic and they were self-immobilizing. And the efficient despotisms like the divine kings, the Shahs of Persia, were too autocratic. And so what was to happen in between? Now, Plato's idea was not sufficiently amenable to the will of the people. And what you see in America today is they want their will to be recognized by whoever the leader is. And so the story of this past election, the story of of Trump's emergence and then of his return, like Odysseus, has been that the people believed that he would um, accommodate and embrace their will. And that, of course, is the way the Roman Empire, our empire, is run. Emperors have to accommodate the people's will and they have to promote it, just as the first uh, archetype of our empire, that is Gaius Julius Caesar, did, and as his nephew Augustus did in creating the system we have. In other words, if emperors really step out of line, and this is true for the whole 1500 years up until the 15th century, if the emperor steps out of line, he's overthrown and a new man becomes, or woman sometimes, becomes emperor. And the people's will is heard. And this is, in effect, where we stand in America today. Americans have no faith that oligarchy, ruled by experts, will do anything but oppress them. So they've turned to the jefe, the man on the white horse, the caudillo.
Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. We're on our way to sacrifice to Augustus, who was a very good caudillo. Very good, and we miss him. We sacrifice to him and believe that he's looking after us like Providence. And then we're going on to the theater where we're told there will be more Roman comedy. I'm not certain, though. Last week was a disappointment. When you do a Terence play, you don't want anything but a happy ending. And there was some twisting to the drama late in the theater last week. I'll forgive them because the weather was inclement. But now it's a beautiful spring in Londinium. By the way, I mentioned our emperor is no longer favored by the Senate. Guess what happens? Domitian, you had your chance. This is Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor.